Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the third Africa-focused webinar of the Global Investigative Journalism Network series, Investigating the Pandemic. It's a great pleasure to host this webinar and to be joined by people from all over the world. In this webinar, titled Open Source Investigations in Africa, we bring together leading experts who will share their advice and tips on how to use publicly available sources to carry out investigations on the continent. So welcome again. Welcome to all of you. My name is Asha Mwilu. I'm the founder and editor-at-large at Debunk Media, a digital media organization in Kenya that's pioneering explanatory journalism for young African audiences, and I will be your moderator for the day. Now, although internet penetration in Africa is lower than other parts of the world, open source investigative journalism tools can be accessed by journalists anywhere on the continent. Yet, despite easy access, many reporters are still unfamiliar with these tools. The COVID-19 pandemic is changing that very quickly. From Lesotho to Liberia, the pandemic lockdowns imposed by governments have compelled investigative journalists to seek out open source investigative tools to continue their work. And as a result, despite the restrictive environment, a significant number of important investigations have been released. In this third Africa-focused GIJN webinar, Open Source Investigations in Africa, we bring together journalists who have used open source tools in different parts of Africa during the COVID-19 crisis to produce groundbreaking investigations. They will share their tips and insights on the tools they have used, the information they unearthed, and how they turned their findings into compelling stories and the impact that those stories have had. I'll introduce today's speakers in a moment, but first, a little bit of information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network for those of you that are not familiar with it. GIJN is the largest global network of non-profit investigative journalism organizations with 187 member organizations in 77 countries worldwide, 17 of which are from sub-Saharan Africa. But GIJN works with journalists everywhere, in non-profits, in commercial organizations, and with freelancers. The network was established to connect and to support them. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I must inform you that we had invited one of Africa's most foremost open source investigative journalists, but he is not here with us. His name is Hopewell Chin'ono from Zimbabwe. On Monday, July the 20th, police broke into Hopewell's home and arrested him. As we speak, he has not yet regained his freedom. Hopewell's investigations revealed fraud in the purchase of COVID-19 supplies in Zimbabwe, and those revelations led to the arrest of the health minister, Dr. Obadiah Moyo, and several senior health ministry officials. But Hopewell's work has seen the government turn on him rather than the people he revealed to have engaged in corrupt activities. In the place of Hopewell, we are joined by Hopewell's colleague, Tawanda Majoni, who is the national coordinator for a GIJN member organization in Zimbabwe called the Information for Development Trust. He will speak about the investigations that Hopewell has been doing, the impacts they have had, and the reasons behind the government's attempts to gag him. I'm also glad to be joined today by two leading experts in open source investigations in Africa who will share their strategies and tips. They will give us their respective presentations that should together last about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Purity Mukami is a data scientist and journalist affiliated with Africa Uncensored, an investigative journalism production house in Kenya. She has also worked with the BBC Africa Eye Investigations team. She's an expert on open source investigations, user-generated content, and fact-checking techniques. Purity holds a degree in mathematics and computer science and a Master of Science in Applied Statistics. She was part of the team, I beg your pardon, that produced Sudan's live stream massacre. Daneel Knoetze is the founder and editor of Viewfinder, an accountability journalism nonprofit in South Africa. His reporting focuses on police criminality and the failure of police oversight mechanisms in South Africa. He is a graduate of Rhodes University and in 2017-2018 was a Hubert H. Humphrey Fellow in the United States, where he worked with Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. We also want to hear from you in the audience. Please send your written questions and messages in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can send questions in English and French, and they will be translated. You can start asking your questions now. When the speakers are finished, the GIJN Africa editor, Benon Oluka, will join us on screen to moderate the questions. Please note that we will share the presentations in the chat box. Finally, please note that we will be recording this session for posting later on YouTube. Let's start with the hottest news before us, and that is what's happening in Zimbabwe, and to our colleague Hopewell. And I'll bring in Tawanda. Tawanda, thank you for joining us this evening. Could you perhaps begin with what's happening in Zimbabwe? Do we know Hopewell's situation at the moment?
Greetings, everybody, and I hope I find you safe and well. And thanks a lot for that question, Asha. You have already given the background to Hopewell Chin'ono's arrest, but the latest that we've heard, checking with the lawyers this afternoon, is that they are still in court for the second session today. You remember that, as Asha said, he was arrested on Monday and then kept in detention, taken to court subsequently. Yesterday he appeared in court, he was denied bail. Today they're continuing with bail. So we're just hoping for the best, that they may rule in favor of him, so that he regains his freedom and continues with his excellent work, the fabulous work that Hopewell has been doing up to now. So that is the situation. The lawyers are saying around about 3 o'clock or 3:30, they might know the position regarding the bail application. So that is the position at the moment.
Thank you for that update, Tawanda, and thank you for making time to join this conversation. We'd like to understand more about Hopewell's work. Perhaps could you tell us what type of investigations has Hopewell been working on, especially around COVID-19 in Zimbabwe?
Thank you, Asha. Let me before I directly respond to that question, maybe just to give you a brief background about Hopewell. I'm not pretending to be the best person who knows him, but I'm a colleague. Hopewell, as you all know, is a print and broadcast journalist who has also been doing documentary films. He's worked for CNN, BBC, ITV, ETV, New York Times, ENCA, among others. Of course, he's been a fellow with Nieman and other foundations, institutions. So this is the background. He's both a print and broadcast journalist, which makes him quite unique in terms of his work. But above all, he's an investigative journalist. And over the years, of course, Hopewell has done a lot of work, especially where television broadcast work is concerned, as well as documentaries. But of late, I think his profile has risen higher in the context of COVID-19, right from the time that Zimbabwe decreed a lockdown up to now. What Hopewell has been doing is he's been using especially microblogging, and I think this is very important for us to understand. He's been using mostly microblogging, short messaging to spread content from the investigations and the findings that he would have made around corruption and wrongdoing, especially in the public sector. His work is mostly focused around procurement. And I'm sure this is the narrative that has dominated scandals of corruption in Zimbabwe from the time COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and we also declared a national disaster in Zimbabwe. As I said, he's been using short messaging to spread, share information that you would have investigated and compiled. You see, if you go back, it's quite unfortunate that his Twitter handle has gone down following his arrest. But you would notice that prior to the arrest, almost every day, Hopewell was there on Twitter, Hopewell was there on social media, posting information about his findings. He was fact-checking public claims. For instance, there was one claim that Zimbabwe had procured PEPs or PPEs, personal protection equipment from Namibia. But Hopewell was among the journalists who said, no, wait a minute, is this true? And then they dug using their sources, using open sources as well, and then found out that actually Namibia didn't. There was no company in Namibia that produced or distributed personal protection equipment, which was a groundbreaking finding that he made as well. So to cut it short, in terms of his focus, he focused around mostly procurement, and there have been so many scandals. Now, I know one thing that people now know about Hopewell so much is the impact of what he's done. I was going to say quite a bit about the impact, but let me start off by saying one of the things that Hopewell he managed successfully to do, effectively to do, was to force prosecution of those that have been named as having been involved in corrupt activities, where procurement and distribution of COVID-19 related items are concerned. And a high-profile case where he contributed to the prosecution is that of the ex-minister. You know that he's been fired from government, the ex-minister of Health, Obadiah Moyo. But it's not only Obadiah Moyo. His work, the work that Hopewell woke up to do every day in the morning and went down to sleep every evening or every night, it also resulted in the arrest of one person who represented a company called Drugs International. His name is Daneel Knoetze. Daneel Knoetze has been taken to court. He is out free on bail at the moment, but we don't know what is going to happen, because Daneel Knoetze himself is so much connected to the president by way of his sons, because he's so much close to the sons of the president. There's lots of pessimism as to whether a meaningful action is going to be taken in the courts against Daneel. But there are other executives from what we call the National Pharmaceutical Company, which is government owned, who were also arrested. Now, this attests to the work that Hopewell has been doing. And then it becomes quite disturbing at the end of the day when you see him getting arrested. I know that when they arrested him, they are giving reasons. They're saying he participated in inciting the public to engage in violent acts against the government. But then not too many people are taking that kind of charge seriously.
And Tawanda, you've mentioned something really interesting. I think many of the people who have joined this webinar would be curious to know. This story appears to have targeted some really high-profile people in government. Would you be able to tell us about some of the methods that Hopewell has been using to gather, to produce, and share his journalistic content? Do you know some of the open source investigation tools that perhaps Hopewell used for some of the stories that you've mentioned?
Many thanks, Asha. I was actually coming to that. As to the specific tools, maybe naturally I wouldn't know. We didn't share that kind of information. Sometimes, sometimes it's good to keep it to yourself, but sometimes, you also share it. But generally, what I would say is, Hopewell used quite a number of methods to source information. And one method that he used quite effectively was crowdsourcing. From the time Hopewell started producing content, especially through Twitter, content on COVID-19 procurement, he managed to harvest a lot of trust from within the public. And then these people turned into natural whistleblowers, giving him information on a daily basis, him fact-checking the information, going through the information, verifying certain things, and then posting the information. And then this kept the debate around corruption relating to COVID-19 so much alive, to the extent that, within a very short space of time, Hopewell had managed to amass about 160,000 followers on his Twitter account, which is quite massive in itself. Hopewell also took advantage of the disgruntlement within the system. That is the current administration that's led by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. There are divisions within the administration because there are people who are not happy with what is happening, but there are people who are also not happy with the style of governance that is there. So they become ready whistleblowers, and he took advantage of that and used the content that they were sharing with him quite effectively and professionally. I would say, to the extent that now a lot of people would wake up wanting to go to his Twitter account, wanting to follow what he's saying. And by the way, the other thing that became so prominent about the work that Hopewell was doing was that even journalists now we're using him as a source of information, especially the online publications. They were now depending on his findings to break stories as well. So that in itself, is a further cap in Hopewell's is a feather in Hopewell's cap, so to speak. Yeah. So Hopewell used he followed the money, and he followed the procurement. He followed the PPEs, the public, personal protection equipment, quite effectively. But he used, as you suggested, some open sources that I won't share at the moment. He went and verified, he followed up on claims that were made by government, and then he also conceptualized around the trends that were taking place. And at the end of the day, there's been so much robust public debate around procurement corruption in Zimbabwe.
Right. Thank you for sharing that, Tawanda. My final question to you, what is the current situation in Zimbabwe in regards to the broader context of state-sanctioned human rights violations? Is Hopewell's arrest sort of like a standalone? Is it a very unique case, or has there been a trend of persecution of investigative journalists and the media in general?
No, there's nothing unique about it. Actually, it's a trend. It's a trend that is re-emerging in Zimbabwe. But let me give you the context, the basic context regarding what's happening at the moment in Zimbabwe. And let me take you back to 2017, late 2017, when the current administration took over power from the now late Robert Mugabe, who had been in power for almost 40 years. They got power with military assistance. Now, if you are polite, you put it that way, but if you are forthright, that was a coup, even though it was a smart coup that took place. Now, the effect of the coup was that it tended to embolden the presence of the military within the governance structures, systems, processes in Zimbabwe, to the extent that today now we more or less like being ruled by a military outfit. And most of the time, they don't have an apology. Naturally, what happens when a coup happens and people from a military background, get into power, what happens? They use the heavy hand. They become paranoid about the people. I always say to myself, how come you got such an administration with guns that is so much afraid of people without guns? But this is the effect of the coup that took place. And you see, this is happening within another unfolding context whereby there's a political economic crisis that is festering now. You see, when these guys got into power, it seemed their hope was that they would be accepted by the international community, they would be accepted locally. But now there's a legitimacy crisis that is especially coming from the election that took place in 2018, because it was contested. Up to now, it's still contested from a political point of view by the general public. So they are so much aware of the crisis that is taking place, and they don't have a clue as to what to do with the crisis. And this is where the problem starts. Normally, when it happens like that, when the ruling administration becomes clueless about how to get out of a crisis, they turn to the vulnerable, they turn to the citizenry, to the people. And basically, this is what is happening in Zimbabwe. That is why you see that now there's increased persecution of the media, increased persecution of human rights defenders, civil society organization members, as well as the general public. We have had, by the way, one thing I might want to share with you is we have had arrests of journalists in the past few weeks. We've had quite a number of journalists being arrested. And the arrest, Yes.
Yeah.
The arrests have tended to center around the journalists getting out to get information that would expose the administration.
Thank you, Tawanda. That's really important to note, because I know we have a lot of journalists joining from the continent who are keen on what's happening in Zimbabwe, and I'm sure we'll probably have some questions coming in for you. I'd like to encourage participants of this webinar, if you have specific questions for Tawanda about Hopewell's situation, about the situation in Uganda, please, I encourage you to write your questions on the chat box. And if you're just joining us and you can hear 2 languages, please go to the globe icon on the right corner of this webinar screen and click the globe icon, then change the language to either English or French, what you prefer, and don't forget to click on mute original audio. So Tawanda, thank you so much for that update, and we hope that everything will go well for Hopewell. We want to discuss. Thank you, Tawanda. We want to discuss some of the investigations around the continent. I'm sure some of the story ideas that Hopewell has been following up on are not very unique to Zimbabwe, as many of us who are covering the pandemic in the rest of the continent will know. And perhaps we can talk about the tools that will be really helpful for some of us who are reporting on COVID-19 and other stories during the pandemic. I want to bring our 2 panelists today. We'll start with Purity Mukami. Purity is a data scientist and an investigative journalist based in Nairobi. She's affiliated with Africa Uncensored. And Purity will begin with will start us off with our first presentation on some of the open source tools that we can use. Purity, welcome, and it's good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Asha. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, thank you.
Awesome. So thanks for the introduction as well. So I don't need to say too much about myself, but just to give a background about my passion for open source skill set and how it comes through for me. For one thing, I'm in journalism, collaborating with investigative journalists, but my most fear is usually how to talk to sources. Like, I'm quite opposite with the journalist who can get information from the public or from experts. So I've been doing most of the investigations just from my laptop. So from COVID started, I never left this desk. Yet I think I've done about five stories so far, just from the internet. So that's why I was excited to share with my colleagues. And forgive me if you're one of the very experienced open source experts, because on this one, I thought I should be as basic as possible, because some of the things when we, the expert, talk seem so simple. So in my presentation, I may be overly basic in showing the steps. So I'm going to share my screen now, and just a caveat, the tools I'm going to show you, I'm going to use some of the softer pieces that we've worked on with my colleagues, but those specific tools, you can use them in proper long-form investigations, because I've used the same to do 2 investigative stories that are not yet published. And that's the reason why I couldn't show you how I did those stories with them. But through that short article, I'm going to show you how you can use those skill sets to do even long form stories and investigations. I hope you can see my slides now. So one of the reasons why open source tools, and when we talk of open source tools, we are talking of things that are outside there in public that we may or may not know about them in our day-to-day life. And with COVID, there came a challenge of movement for journalists, so they couldn't be in field as before COVID. And yet there was too much information online, some not true, some true. And according to a recent study, there was so much demand for journalistic information because now there was a lot of information out there. So if you're using, or if you had open source skill set, you would use that to filter through the much information that is going on and be able to still do stories, even while you cannot be in field as much as before. Again, because of the health risk to the journalist, and also the lockdowns that were instilled in various countries at different times. Also, the other challenge was, as we all know, government procurement and how they spend the money becomes a bit lenient during pandemics because it's an emergency. So the procurement processes can now be bypassed. The law allows that they don't have to have open procurement procedures, the long ones, because there is the pandemic. So one of the things that came to my mind is the public is not able to get to accountability of the government, how the money is being spent. We're getting accountability in terms of the infection and the health pandemic, but how the money is being spent wasn't going to be easy because there are leeways during a pandemic or during an emergency. So one of the investigations that I worked on using the open source skills was to try and see how spending happened during Ebola. And it was very, very eye-opening. And even now that much more mismanagement has happened and there are more news coming up about how the spending is not transparent, you can see the exact same pattern that happened during the Ebola and how we were procuring items. And that I did only from a leak, just a leak that we had for over 2 years. But now because of COVID, I was like, okay, let me try and see what I can see more now using the past pandemics. The story will be published soon, maybe in 2 weeks, and I will share with you. So that is why it was important to make use of the open source skill set. And open source is not like magic, guys. It's things that we normally use, our phones. And here, when I thought, what would I share in terms of tools and insights? The list I gave you there, starting with Google, ending with public databases, the most important tools, or the tools I've used most widely, is Google and public databases. And Google, everybody knows how to use Google for anything. But now you just need to set to think of it as a source of information, just like the way I know as journalists, we get information just by listening to people. Now it's about listening to the internet. So like for our fact-checking desk, most of the misinformation comes through WhatsApp. As you know, maybe in Kenya, 90% of people use WhatsApp. When you see some information being shared on WhatsApp, the first thing you should ask yourself, where is this information coming from? And the immediate thing we do is just copy that information, a few sentences from that, whatever is being shared, and you're not sure of whether it's true or not, and paste it on Google using the quotes. We've had a lot of webinars on those targeted searches on Google. So you just paste there and you realize the information that is on a closed source like WhatsApp or Telegram is coming from open sources like Facebook and Twitter, where people can share stuff openly. So Google will help you in it, whenever you're not sure where this information is coming from, you can always Google there to see where else is it shared. Also from my investigation, when you see maybe company names, company postal addresses, company contacts, the first place I go to is to Google, and I put whatever information, the name of the company or the phone number or the address, and I'll see other places where it has, the company as appears. And for example, companies which do business with government, you just certainly start seeing them appearing in other government documents, which unfortunately, like in Africa, we don't have like all the information put together. It's scattered like in different ministry websites, different public organizations. But Google is going to be able to show you where that company is doing business, or sometimes doing business with a different name, but the same phone number, or the same phone number, but different PO box. And you follow the trail just from searching that. The other thing I use Google for is to, for example, when you get sources, when you get information or whistleblowing from the public in form of videos or images, you can use Google. I'll show you in a slide down, in 2 slides down, how to check, is this image from this person who says he took this photo here, or they just got it from elsewhere where it hadn't been shared. And when I'm checking for videos or for images, I'll always use three Google, TinyEye, and Yandex together, because you may see one thing on one search engine and not on the other. My other favorite tool is image metadata or video metadata tools, like the Jeffries or the metadata to go.com. When the image is not downloaded from the internet, like from Twitter or from Signal or WhatsApp, you may be able to see if this person is telling me, I took this photo from Nairobi and I'm sending it to you, you're able to check whether that image, the location, the date it was taken, and all that. Again, with the whois.com, you're able to check for company profiles. You'll be able to see like people who are behind the management of a company website. So that's what I use Whois for. Wayback Machine. For a moment, I'm going to put to stop sharing the slides, because I got trained how to use Wayback Machine way last year, but it took me like 6 months to ever be able to use it, because I never knew, once I'm there, where do I go? So I'm going to use the Africa Uncensored website. If the story had been published, I will show you how I used it in my story. But for now, I'm going to show you how you use the Wayback Machine to check. Sometimes when companies are being investigated, they change the information on websites. But Wayback Machine is able to keep, like, to archive what was happening on the website. So for the longest time, I only used to get to this place, and I never used to know what do I get to see from the website. So, and sometimes I could see, yeah, okay, this means the Africa Uncensored posted something on the 20th March. But I never knew I had to click here to see what was posted. So I would always be investigating and saying, people are always using this open source tool, Wayback Machine, but how do they get to use it? So I thought in this presentation, someone would be in the same position as me. So when it finishes loading, you will see what was posted on 21st March. And you can, if it was, for example, you're checking the board of directors, or the company has tried to change maybe top employees or management, you'll be able to see what changed and how that changed. Okay, so that's, always remember, you have to click that bit when you're in Wayback Machine. So back to the slides. So the other one is Twitter. I'm not going to dwell in it so much. Facebook, I use it as an amateur, like no magic. When I'm investigating someone and I can use Google and use site :, and then website facebook.com, it will take me to pages that person owns. And I will just be having fun on their page, checking their photos, comments on their photos, and that way I'm able to make like family relationships to see. From those comments, you can deduce, it helps you put points and points together. So other things that you could use during COVID, they are usually databases they are like public information databases that we usually won't think as journalists that they are useful. So when everybody was busy trying to find which animal is responsible of moving the COVID virus from animals to humans, people are talking about this little animal called the pangolin. Forever, even before COVID, there is a site called Site Trained Database that is managed by UNEP, and it records all the trained on wildlife trained, especially the banned the animals that are banned from being traded. And I use that database together with another kind of a PDF, a report from another organization called Traffic, and we worked on a whole story about the pangolin trade in Africa. Another database I used during COVID was Google. And Google has like a mobility database where they are you can see when during lockdowns, are the lockdown working or not? And it could show where people have reduced movement and activity and where activity has increased, like in the residential. But now the one I wanted to share with you today was this photo went up around 7th and 8th of April. And this is the time lockdowns were being put in place. And people were trying to encourage the idea of feeding the vulnerable, because now in Africa, most of the population live below poverty line. And this photo was shared about 5,000, like retweeted 5,000 times from a Nigerian minister who had shared it. Although I should note that later she apologized that she was misled by a friend. I'm sure also some journalists retweeted that photo. That one I'm sure. And the idea was, people are saying, this is Rwanda, this is how you should be distributing food, and see how Rwanda is doing it. But this was not in Rwanda, but it was being shared by, even in, some other people saying it in Zimbabwe, by the way. I saw some days later, even after this was debunked, there was still people saying now it's Zimbabwe. So why I chose to share, to show the step-by-step example with this one, it's because as much as we see open source information there in the internet, it's not time to put away the journalistic basics. The fact that this photo was posted somewhere else last year, it does not mean that it was in Gambia. You have to prove, to verify things beyond reasonable doubt physically. So what we did with this photo, apart from just saying it was in Gambia, we went down and tracked the exact place where the photo was taken. And this is how we did it. Because of time, I'm not going to go back to toggle between the Google, but I'm going to show you how we use Google. Using Google, when you're in Google and you choose images, there is going to be an icon for a photo, like a camera. And when you click on it, it's going to ask you whether you want to paste a URL or to upload an image. So from the tweet, you download the image using Twitter downloader, and or you can even screenshot the image, and then you save it somewhere and you upload it there. When you upload it, if you practice that today, you're going to get so many links with that image because so many organizations fact-checked it. But if you're doing that in April, you won't get too many results. And you could get results from Facebook, where it was posted. It was posted by a number of Facebook pages. And now in those Facebook pages, sometimes they are not in the language that you can understand, but thank God there is the translation. So whenever you're checking, always use the translation button and read through the comments. When we talk of people using Facebook for investigation, there's no magic. It's like reading the comments and interacting with this information just the way you interact with usual expert or other people who get to give us stories. And in the comments, it mentioned that this was a certain sheikh who was sharing food to Muslims during a Ramadan back in Gambia. So before we got to the name of this village, they mentioned the name of the foundation that was sharing food. And now I go back again to my favorite Google search and I search that foundation name. And we find that this foundation and also the donated toilets in a certain village called Jarumekoto village. And again, I use my Google. That's why I told you it was number 1 on the list because I use it like all the time on anything. And when you Google Jarumekoto and you put the quotes, it gives you now the village. And back to number 3, when we go to this Facebook page that had shared this image, the image came with some other 5 photos. Now, when you're looking at those photos, always look out for visible clues. What can I see with my eyes? Apart from the picture, what can I see on that picture? I can see the yellow jerry cans, because you'll see there are many other places that did the same. Apart from the food stuff, what else can I see? You could see some toilets, some square toilets with windows. Look for such clues, like have fun with it. So when you Google Jarumekoto village, you find 3 mosques in that village. How do you know? So I started with the first mosque, and you zoom in. You zoom using the plus sign on the Google search. You zoom in and you try to compare. What can I see in this photo that is visible in these mosques? So I realized the mosque that, because of one of the photos that was on the Facebook post, included this. And when you look at the foodstuffs arranged on this photo are the same as the foodstuffs arranged in the photo that was being tweeted. But this second photo helped me with more visual clues. So you can see the shape of this mosque and this tower, very important. So when I was zooming into each of the 3 mosques, I was looking at which mosque has such a similar shape. And it happened to be Jarumekoto Mosque. But I wanted to know the person who took this photo, where were they standing? So if I had time to go into the map itself, I want to show when you zoom into Jarumekoto Mosque, you will see some trees where I was able to identify this tree that is coming from the corner. But I did not stop there. As much as I could see from the image, this is it. We now had to contact our friend who is a Gambian journalist, and I asked him, was this photo taken from this mosque and where? And he went like, I remember I passed there, but 10 years ago. It's actually 5 kilometers from my rural home. And he could explain to me, this is that the food stuff are arranged in the playground of the primary school, which is right opposite the mosque. So when we talk of verification, it does not mean like you just stop from what you're seeing on the internet. You have to go to an extra mile and ascertain for yourself beyond reasonable doubt. So that's how we did that verification. But now for more sensitive investigations where you'll be talking about specific people who can get you into legal issues, just like Hopewell and everything. Now, confirm that, for example, if you see family relationships on Facebook or on Instagram, don't say, oh, I saw them saying, oh, this is my mom or this is my sister. You have to either use correspondence or use other records like people. We use people, you can use the CCRP investigative dashboard to ask for like now the specific research to now ascertain what you've found for yourself online. Use human intelligence. That is now where crowdsourcing comes in. You can just post a post and ask people who know more about this, or if you have those professional WhatsApp groups, re-verify what you've seen on the internet. Also now use official records. So from my end, I can dig out about a company, everything, and I'm sure about what I'm seeing. But I have to go an extra mile and now purchase the official records, for example, from the government company registry. Yeah, I think I have gone way beyond my time. I'm sorry, Asha.
No worries, Purity. Thank you. I mean, it was really compelling. You did begin by saying that it was the basics, but isn't that the fundamental of open source investigations? So thank you so much for sharing your insights. And now we're learning a bit more about some of the investigations you've done here in Kenya, including the registrar and official corruption in Kenya. So that was really interesting to see your techniques. To our audience members, please, if you have any questions specific to any specific panelist, to Purity, to Daneel, who was about to begin his presentation, or to Tawanda, please leave your question or your comments on the Q&A chat. And in case you're having problems with the translation, just make sure you follow the instructions at the top of the chat box on how to change your preferred language. So thank you, Purity. We'll go to our second panelist today, Daneel. Welcome, and please feel free to share your presentation with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I trust you can hear me. I am just going to share my screen. Are we good? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Daneel Knoetze. I'm the editor of new investigative journalism outfit in South Africa called Viewfinder. Viewfinder launched last year with an investigation of police brutality, but specifically on the police watchdog. And our main finding was really that these cases were being closed prematurely to inflate performance statistics, while denying, of course, victims justice for the abuses that they had suffered. Our investigation over last year, the previous year, let me just say at the onset, I don't see myself as an open source specialist per se. I see myself as a journalist who is learning to use open source material as a way to enable and empower my investigations to make findings that can be applied to hold institutions accountable. And so I hope that my presentation will speak to other journalists that kind of see open source as potentially an intimidating subject matter, but that would like to learn more about how to use it in conventional investigative journalism. And so the main source material I think that we relied on was public records, which we got both through PIA access to information requests, but also through developing good sources within institutions, and also looking at what was publicly available through websites. Parliamentary minutes was very important to me, because often there are records uploaded. So I would like to speak to how that investigation morphed into something which was much more centered on. Can everyone see my presentation fully? I think I might.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
It's fine. Okay, good. So the South African COVID-19 lockdown was announced by President Ramaphosa on the 23rd of March of this year. Sorry, I see the dates wrong there. It was March, not May. And during that first week, we really saw a narrative moving from a public health, a cooperation narrative to the populace, to the public, to one of securitization and enforcement, which was really seeing our police minister taking the lead in the communication as opposed to our health minister. The next slide contains video footage that I got from a source which shows some violence, but I think it demonstrates that the concerns that were being that were evident in this kind of like shift in the narrative just before the lockdown was fulfilled, and a lot of these kinds of images started making the rounds. This was sent to me by a source in GIJN, and it shows purportedly a police assault taking place in GIJN, the Western Cape, outside of Cape Town. What was concerning about that video was also an indication that the method of assault, a sjambokking or a leather whip or a plastic whip, which has a lot of connotations in the past in apartheid, was being employed in police. But the South African public was just overwhelmed. We were getting these reports coming in, and it really presented an existential question for us as journalists looking at the subject matter. Our work takes months sometimes to kind of like come to findings, and here we had like an urgent, a real-time crisis unfolding in terms of police brutality. And it was evident to me that we wouldn't be able to keep pace with like monitoring. We had roving news journalists that were doing great work on the ground, and we as a newsroom are under capacity. So I had to look back in our experiences to see what kind of like public records and open sources we might be able to bring to bear on the situation and to bring perspective. And so the first thing I did is I put a lot of pressure on the police watchdog, because I knew that they had access to statistics being generated in real time about abuses, and that they could make public. And after a couple of days of sustained pressure, I managed to get them, and this is just an indication of those statistics as they published in the annual report, and that's how I knew this is over 7 years amalgamated statistics. And the pressure, I guess my first tip is to look at what public records are available, and then the means available to yourself, both interpersonal, putting pressure, phoning spokespeople, putting pressure on government departments, but also using your access to information mechanisms available. They call them FOIA in the United States, PIA in South Africa. I'm sure some governments are not as transparent in other African countries, but that such mechanisms might exist. And before I speak about the statistics that we managed to get out of government at the time of lockdown, I just wanted to digress quickly and make a point about statistical tables that you might see in annual reports. A journalist in the United States said to me, and it's always stuck with me, if you see a table of statistics that looks like this, you better assume that there's a very rich database upon which it is based, of which it is a summary, and that database is often a public record that should be available to the public. And this is the database that much of my investigation has been premised on. This is just a screen grab of one police station, but the database essentially is a record of 72,000 criminal complaints against the police gathered over 20 years of government record keeping. And this really just gives us an insight into the trends, the particularities of this particularly violent abuse of power that our state continues to mete out in the South African context, even 20, 25 years after apartheid. So my hypothesis was that if we're seeing a lot of these reports during lockdown, that certainly there would be an uptick in cases being reported, and that it would be really important for us as monitoring the situation as journalists to have access to that information out of government at our fingertips in real time so that we could respond and get a clear overview of the situation. Interestingly, my hypothesis was not fulfilled. There was actually a turn down in the number of reports, and something I think I've given it a lot of thought, and something I think that had bearing on that is the fact that reporting was very difficult in a very hard lockdown situation in the South African context. But one statistic that was consistent with prior trends was the rate at which police officers had killed people. So in South Africa, over the last 20 years, South African police officers kill somebody at least, or on average, once a day, every single day, and it's been going on for 20 years. And that, the 3 deaths during the first 3 days of lockdown really stuck out to me as being an indication of not that we were seeing something completely new, but that we were magnifying through the lens of the pandemic an inequality, because these happen obviously in poor and under-resourced communities, an inequality and a malaise in our society that often remains hidden. And my interpretation was really to use the data that was available to us from years of record keeping by government to bring findings to bear on the current situation, and to make the point that the attention that COVID-19 has brought to the securitization and abuses at the hands of the state gives us a real opportunity to deal and to reckon with a much deeper malaise in our society, I think. This is not a new problem. It was something that has been with us all along. And I think that pandemics create that opportunity for us to reflect, to hold a mirror up to our society, and to look at the issues of inequality and marginalization and abuses of power, and to ensure that the world that we arise out of, or that arises out of the pandemic, does not regress on those key indicators, but that we use the pandemic as an opportunity to hold our institutions accountable on these. And so that was the point that I tried to make, bringing the data findings to bear. Incidentally, just to return to the issue of frequency, there was actually a spike. It was just delayed. And so over the first 6 weeks of lockdown, as represented by these figures out of government, and I must say, I think Viewfinder's advocacy and pressure for open data around this issue really created a lot of appetite for it, both within Parliament, but within the general news cycles, with news reporting. And we saw a lot more transparency from the police watchdog as a result of that, which I think is very encouraging. Unfortunately, that's kind of closed, that window is closed up again. So there was the spike in police brutality as seen in the data for the most recent period, or compared to the same period in the previous year, but it wasn't as significant. And I think that really bears the point that this is a much deeper and a much more systemic issue that we need to deal with, that the pandemic is, and indeed the Black Lives Matter movement this year has given us an opportunity to do. So producing that story, looking at the historical data, but the current context, and what open records or open source data records from the past can bring perspective to news items and manifestations and abuses of power that we're seeing unfolding in real time. Really, it was something that was a first for me, and it encouraged me to try and do more. And so when we started getting reports of police corruption, extortion, curbside bribery happening around these new regulations and people finding themselves in contravention of new laws, and police extorting money to avoid arrest and things like, for people to avoid arrest, gave me the idea to look into the data again. And I think that the tip or the takeaway I would like to propose here is that, open source material are records that are available to us in conventional journalistic kind of like endeavors and questions. They do not sit somehow outside of normal journalism. And so the database was used to really make the point that lockdown, first of all, created, when we look at the trends, lockdown created conditions that were ripe for exploitation by corrupt police officers in terms of bribery and in terms of smuggling. But it also gave us a new finding that right down from the most banal forms of police corruption that we found in our sample of 100 cases, we saw escalating levels of corruption, higher amounts of money, bigger abuses of power, and more senior police officers being accused in these case data records. And I think that also gave us an opportunity to bring a new finding to bear with the interest that was created around police corruption in the COVID-19 scenario. Finally, one of the more complex and specific investigations we did was testing a decision around the police watchdog's decision to clear police of wrongdoing in the first death related to the lockdown enforcement. This death happened after a police assault, but because the person was judged to have died of a heart attack, the police watchdog ruled that to be a natural cause of death, and therefore wrote off the docket and closed the case and stopped investigating the assault. And the records we relied on, and which I'd always like to remind people of, is, in a situation where government is performing a duty, there are procedures, a service, they are like an investigation. There are procedures, there are laws, there are regulations against which the actual action that is taken can be tested against. And so I think in understanding something that feels intuitive, or in uncovering and unpacking something that feels and looks intuitively wrong, there is often source material, open source material against which your hypothesis can be tested. In this case, I looked at the investigative procedures to see that the investigator failed on various requirements of the investigation, including interviewing eyewitnesses. Incidentally, this was an interesting attempt at doing a field investigation, which was required, which really required engaging people, and often would have required me to go to a location to do that remotely through phone calls, through connecting with people on WhatsApp, to asking people that to take phones to loan to people who I needed to speak to as witnesses. And in this way, we really uncovered that this assault certainly did happen, that it probably had something to do with a heart attack that was suffered by Mr. Petrus Michels, and that an inquiry is still warranted. And indeed, the docket was reopened. Parliament put a lot of pressure on the police watchdog around this particular case. And I think it was important for us as well to take our open source kind of engagement with the lockdown away from just one of the statistics, and to remind that these are actual people that are affected by this. So having learned kind of new ways of using the data and the open source kind of records from within government at our disposal, the question for me became, so what next? And I think the big thing and a takeaway is that often if you get hold of a big resource, it's going to be impossible for you as a single entity or a single journalist to do justice to all of the possibilities therein. And so what we're doing at the moment is we're trying to, and these are, incidentally, this is the first time that I'm showing screen grabs of this development in progress. So there's an exclusive for you guys. This is a map that's being built out, which maps out every single police precinct in South Africa and gives you a detailed statistical breakdown of every crime that the police have been accused of in those particular areas. What we're hoping is to create a resource of our open source data that we've accessed for other journalists to be able to use and incorporate in their reporting. And this actually came into play yesterday when a journalist was looking into a killing that happened in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa and asked me for a comment. And I told them that I could do better than a comment. I could give them an analysis, a data analysis for the track record of their own police station on these types of killings, assaults, and other abuses within which to locate their particular case. And that just kind of like affirmed to me the power that this kind of data can demonstrate or bring to other journalists, civil society, and to researchers looking at this. And so my last takeaway is to collaborate, or my last tip, I guess, for journalists looking at doing more of this sort of work is to share, to enable one another, to collaborate, and to look at where your shortfalls are. And because this is being built by somebody who's much more au fait than myself with data visualization, to look at where your own shortfalls are and to fill those gaps with capacity and collaborations. Because if we work together, I guess we can ensure that our records and our open source material have a bigger impact than if we work alone. And I think with that, I'd like to sign off. This is just an image of my team and myself, just to show that we really are a small outfit, but we're trying to punch above our weight, at least in the police oversight work that we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daneel, and I mean, such a brilliant presentation. Thank you for staying true to the spirit of, collaborative journalism, open source investigative journalism, by also sharing the data and giving participants of this webinar that exclusive. We'll be sure to check it out. So I want to introduce Benon Oluka, who is the GIJN African editor, and he'll be taking us through the Q&A session. If you have any question for Purity or Daneel, please write your question, put your question down on the Q&A chat box on the side, and we'll get back to that. So Benon, you can take over now.
Okay, thank you, Asha. And welcome to everybody who has joined us. We're happy to have you. And thank you for everyone who has sent us questions from different corners of the continent and the world. I have a number of questions. I'll start with Daneel being the last speaker. There's a question here, actually two questions in one from two different people who are saying, I'm sort of adding it up all together now. What advice do you have for investigative journalists in countries where the freedom of information laws are non-existent? How can a journalist maneuver through such situations? Daneel, I'll ask you to take on that to start with.
Yeah, and thank you, Benon. Thank you for the question. It's a very valid one. And as I was drafting my presentation, I was quite aware, I guess, and as I was presenting it, that the option of going through an access to information request route in many countries is not available. Incidentally, in South Africa, it's not always easy. And many of the public records that should have been publicly available and that are not illegal to possess or unlawful to possess are obstructed by the very information officers that should be engaging us and making it available. And I'm currently dealing with a battle around my work, because it was much easier before people knew who I was to get access to information than after I'd kind of started exposing these things. My advice, or the thing that worked for me, was to build progressively closer relationships with people that were inside organizations. I know turning whistleblowers is not an easy thing to do. There's serious consequences for people if they get outed. But for me, I found that within these institutions, there are always people that are upset and dismayed by cover-ups and poor practices becoming systemic, and are actually wanting to do the right thing. So middle management within your various organizations that you're looking at in government, Googling, just looking if anyone's ever said anything on a forum, engaging people through social media, trying to find out and build a profile of who might be a sympathetic source within an institution and might have access to that. That worked for me. I know it might not always work. In lieu of that, I'd be happy to hear from other participants if they've got, they've also got insights.
Thank you, Daneel. A quick follow-up question for you. What do you do when your government won't share any data or is lying about things like death rates, hospital supplies, and more? Can you use data from outside your own country? Are there alternatives for journalists in countries where the government is either withholding information or lying about, lying about the information that they're providing?
I think it speaks to a similar issue that was raised just in the previous question. Certainly another thing that I have found valuable before I started looking at data analysis. I mean, you do need access to the data to be able to do the kinds of analysis that I did with that, with the case data. But certainly doing on-site investigations in terms of going to the locations where you expect abuses of power to be happening has yielded amazing results for me. One example is that there's a lot of lying that happens around the occupation of land and the eviction of shack dwellers in South Africa. The narrative is spun by government that this is that these people are criminals and that they haven't been there for very long, when in actual fact these are established communities often. And so going to a location and vetting with your own eyes in lieu of accessing data has always been a sure fallback for me. The facts of the matter as they speak on the ground cannot be contested if you've got documentary evidence thereof through photos, through interviews. And I think that hard legwork as an investigative journalist, there's no substitute for it in lieu of getting access of these records. But in terms of records outside of the country, I don't know, I'm just looking at the South African context, unfortunately, so I might not be best placed to speak to that possibility.
On the same question, could we have Tawanda respond to that? Because, given the context of what's happening in Zimbabwe, how do you deal with such situations where, the government is either lying, as happened in the case of the story that Hopewell was investigating? How have you dealt with such situations in Zimbabwe? Tawanda?
Okay, sorry, I had forgotten to unmute. No, I was saying the most ready thing to do when you're faced with a situation whereby either government is spreading falsehoods about certain issues, or government is refusing with information, and then you have the suspicion that this is what is happening, especially in terms of the falsehoods that are being spread by the government, is to go ahead as a journalist and dig it up using any methods that are available to you. Naturally, that's the thing to do. But where there is opacity, and opacity, say in Zimbabwe, is such a culture, they would never want to give you information because they're so much afraid that, the more information that's out there in the public domain, the more exposed they become. So they would rather not give you the information. We have the Constitution, Section 62 of the Zimbabwean Constitution obligates public institutions, public entities, as well as private entities to share information of public interest whenever it's requested. So that becomes a constitutional issue. You can do litigation in that particular regard. There's an opportunity for litigation in that particular regard at the Constitutional Court. I know that up to now, the Zimbabwean media hasn't started doing that, but from where we're standing as IGT, we have been conceptualizing around legal advocacy on those issues, because there's so much opacity, there's so much resistance to giving out information. But where falsehoods are concerned, I think it's the duty of the journalist to challenge the falsehoods by digging up the information and presenting it into the public domain.
Thank you for that, Tawanda. For Purity, there are a number of really interesting questions here. The first one says, when sending a video, you said at some point that when sending a video, you send it by email so that the metadata will be intact, but we often run into the issue of a video being too large for an email. Are there other ways to send videos without losing that metadata? Purity?
Yeah, thank you, Benon. I think to answer that one, you can use like file sharing tools. Instead of sending through email, you can have like a Google Drive where you can buy expanded memory, and then you can just share the video so that you put the content there and then you share. Some other times, if it's somewhere where someone can bring, maybe can share with you a flash disk or something, if there is possibility of movement, delivery can work as well. Yeah, so you can create shared documents. That will be the solution to that. But for images, they can email them one at a time.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question for you. Yours is a beginner's guide, really, and this is a beginner's question. If one is quite new to exploration of open source investigation, after the tools like Google, the FB search and video verification that you shared, what other tools would you recommend next for someone to familiarize themselves with?
So if you go to Bellingcat website, you can find, there are many people who put together different tools. You can also check First Draft website. They have like really simplified videos on how to do all these things.
Okay.
Have I answered? I hope I have answered that one.
You've answered it, yes. A third question, aside from using Google and general search engines, where would you recommend someone looking for data? What kind of data sets and databases would you recommend?
So if you're in Kenya, I find the Gazette notices. You can find it on Code for Africa's Open Gazette, gazette.africa. Because those Gazette will have like most people who have been appointed to certain positions. So if you wanted to know like who's responsible for this and the other, you can check through the Gazette notices. Also, if you're in Kenya, also kenyalaw.org has all the court cases uploaded there. So court cases are amazing because they expose more than you need. So if you're investigating like companies, the court cases, and I don't know about other countries, but Kenya, we have that kenyalaw.org. But when you're also searching, I find many Excel sheets and PDFs in various different weird websites you did not expect, but through the search engine, you discover where such PDFs are stored. So it's to sharpen your search skills, to be able to do that. But also, if you need anything, you can always get in touch with me if to see if I can help.
Thank you, Purity. There is another question, and I think this is open to whoever will be in position to answer it. You know, we've talked about the importance of open data and open source records and the potential that they have for investigations. But what other open source tools and techniques can we use, especially in cases or in countries where there is no published data?
Where there are no public data. Before I finished the other comment, I wanted to give an example of a friend of mine who wanted to get the police brutality documents, just like Daneel has talked about, even if it's not published, if you're consistent enough. My friend went and she was given like a booklet of all the case registrations in a booklet. So it's also to be positive enough and patient. When you see a crack, if you're shown a crack, push your hand into it. Ask consistently, but I also thought the other thing is to consistently talk about the gaps of that data. So for example, in Kenya, we have procurement data on a government website, but it has so much missing. So exposing the gaps in whatever data is there or not there also builds into the narrative of having the data open. Because I also think sometimes it's not how available the data is. How much have we been asking for the data? Even as journalists or other organizations, how much do we ask for the data? If we ask for it enough of times such that it is general knowledge that we need this data, we are entitled to this data, then it will change slowly. One of the things last year, the Article 19, an organization that follows about the legal issues for journalists, they collected all the FOIAs. If you had ever sent an email to a government organization and you never got a response, so they listed all those to push for more data to be made available. So asking, and sometimes the data doesn't have to come in rows and columns. I'm a statistician, yes, but I've realized most data is not necessarily even in rows and columns. Sometimes people are tweeting like these people have been attacked by police, or this and the other thing has happened. Even collecting your own data. Sometimes I've put like survey questions and share a link and ask people to respond on what they know about a situation or what their opinions are. So you can also create your own data slowly by slowly.
Okay, thank you, Purity. Now, given the circumstances that our colleague Hopewell is in, I would like to end with a question by Sesei Kamara, and I'll ask Daneel and Tawanda to respond very, very briefly. He says, what would you tell an investigative journalist in a country where journalists are arrested or locked up in jail often for doing their work? I think this is less about open source investigations, but more about really staying true to journalism in difficult circumstances. So I'll start with Daneel, and then Tawanda can wind up.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, looking at issues of murder and corruption in the police is not always comfortable in terms of knowing whether you are being intercepted and whether there's a risk associated with it. So it's something that I've given thought to. Obviously, South Africa is in a much better place in terms of press freedom than many other countries. But I do think that building a solid network of editors and supporters and journalists and civil society and people that are influential but carry the legitimacy and the torch, I guess, for access to information and for the work that investigative journalists do is indispensable. And so it's less a question for journalists and more a question for all of us as to whether we are creating the networks to support one another when things go wrong. And I think that's why platforms like created by the Global Investigative Journalism Network are so important. And I think that increasingly, it's important not to insulate yourself in your work, but to network and to ensure that you have the support of your colleagues for the important work that you're doing. And so I'd encourage everyone to both reach out, but also to be accepting and to be open in terms of supporting one another.
Thank you. Tawanda, the last word is from you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yes, networking is very, very crucial for the protection of journalists, you know, hedging themselves against attacks, against persecution. But I always say the best form of shield you can always create for yourself as a journalist, particularly an investigative journalist, is to ensure that your work meets the standards, the professional standards. Let your work protect you. So be as professional as possible, be truthful as possible, be accurate as possible, ensure that there are no gaps, because they always want to look for gaps in your story in order to further victimize you. Yes, they will arrest you, but your work is going to salvage you.
Okay, thank you, Tawanda. I would like to apologize to whoever, to anyone whose question I haven't asked. We'll use it to build story tips for the information that we share later on investigative journalism. Now I'll hand over back to Asha.
Thank you, Benon, and what a lovely way to end that conversation, Tawanda, by just advising journalists across the continent about accuracy. And that's what we've been learning in this webinar, how to use open source investigations to make our stories and our investigations more powerful, more accurate, and more impactful. So thank you for that. To the GIJN team, thank you for organizing 3 webinars specifically for Sub-Saharan Africa. And to our participants, this is just the beginning. If you want to learn more, GIJN has really great tips on their website. If you go to GIJN.org, they have very many tip sheets on some of the things that our panelists have discussed today and more, including how to protect yourself. So thank you, GIJN. Thank you to our translators, to our panelists, Tawanda Majoni, Purity Mukami, and Daneel Knoetze. Thank you so much. And to you, our audience, thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. Before I say goodbye, our webinar, the last one for this series, is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? New Avenues for Investigative Reporting on the Pandemic. It will be held on July the 30th. Please follow GIJN's Twitter feed @GIJN, and you'll find a newsletter on the website for more information about the final webinar for this season. Thank you so much. I've been your moderator, Asha Mwilu. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, and have a good one. Bye-bye.